settle and imagine the whispers that travelled through the dimly lit streets of Salem village. The air was thick with suspicion, every shadow cast in doubt. Neighbours eyed each other warily, questioning even the most innocent of gestures. It was a time when the unseen was more terrifying than the visible, and what couldn't be understood was often condemned. In this quiet corner of the world, hysteria gripped a community and turned the ordinary into the extraordinary, where simple accusations snowballed into devastating consequences. What began as fear of the unknown spiraled into a series of trials and executions that left an indelible mark on American history. Over the next few moments, we'll unravel this dark chapter, peeling back the layers to understand the historical background that set the stage, the key events that unfolded, and the individuals whose lives were forever altered by the trials. We'll also explore the lingering impact these events had on society and what lessons we can draw from this chilling tale today. Before we dive into the heart of this tragic story, allow me to introduce you to the ASMR History Hub. Here, I aim to explore the mysteries and milestones of history in a way that's both calming and immersive. With every word, I'll whisper the past into the present, inviting you to relax as we journey together through time. The Salem Witch Trials are just one of many captivating stories I explore, so if you like ASMR and history, consider subscribing and or commenting down below with ideas for future videos. Now, let's get back to the video. Our first step in this journey leads us to Puritan New England, a world of strict beliefs and rigid societal rules that laid the foundation for what was to come. Puritan New England in the late 17th century was a world unlike anything we know today. It was a society built on strict religious principles, where life revolved around faith, and God's will was considered the foundation of every decision, every judgment. The Puritans believed they were a chosen people, destined to create a city upon a hill, a community so pure that it would serve as a shining example to the world. But with that lofty ideal came intense pressure. Every misstep, every sin, no matter how small, was seen as an affront to God, and in their eyes, the devil was never far from those who strayed from the path of righteousness. The Puritans' fear of the devil was more than just a vague notion. It was an all-consuming terror. To them, Satan wasn't just a symbolic force of evil. He was real, lurking in the shadows, working to corrupt the souls of the faithful. Witchcraft, in their minds, was not just superstition, but a direct attack from the devil himself. A person accused of witchcraft wasn't merely practicing forbidden rituals. They were believed to be in league with the ultimate enemy of God. It was this fear that created a fertile ground for the events that would soon unfold in Salem. The social structure in Salem and the surrounding communities added fuel to the fire. It was a patriarchal society, deeply hierarchical, where men held the power and women were expected to be subservient this rigid structure, tensions brewed. Salem was divided, both geographically and socially. On one side, there was Salem town, a bustling mercantile hub full of traders and wealth. On the other side was Salem village, a more isolated agrarian community that clung tightly to traditional Puritan values. The villagers viewed the town's wealth and growing independence with suspicion, believing it to be a sign of moral decay and a departure from their original religious mission. These divisions created an atmosphere of distrust and resentment. Salem village in particular was rife with internal conflict. Neighbours quarrelled over property lines and livestock, and old grudges festered beneath the surface. It was a place where any small act of kindness or perceived slight could carry enormous weight. The people of Salem lived on a knife's edge, their daily lives filled with whispers of discontent, simmering anger, and the ever-present fear that God's wrath might soon descend upon them. These social tensions weren't confined to Salem alone. Throughout New England, communities were grappling with a host of anxieties: Native American raids, political instability, and a series of smallpox outbreaks added to the sense that their world was spiralling out of control. The Puritans saw these hardships as divine punishment. Surely, they thought, these calamities were signs that the devil was at work, sowing chaos and destruction in their once pure world. Adding to the tension was the fact that witchcraft accusations weren't new to the region. As early as the 1640s, several people in New England had been accused of practicing witchcraft. In one case, a woman named Margaret Jones was hanged in 1648 after being found guilty of being in league with Satan. The people of Salem would have been well aware of these earlier cases. They knew the dangers of witchcraft, and more importantly, they knew the consequences. The fear of witches was not an abstract concern. It was rooted in their history and their deeply held beliefs. Across the Atlantic, Europe had been consumed by its own witchcraft hysteria, with thousands of people, mostly women, tried and executed for their alleged ties to the devil. These stories of European witch hunts would have echoed through the narrow streets of Salem, reinforcing the belief that witches were not only real, but also a very immediate threat. In this highly charged environment, accusations of witchcraft were not taken lightly. They were a matter of life and death, and the people of Salem were more than ready to believe the worst. And so, when the first whispers of witchcraft began to circulate in Salem, it was as if a match had been struck in a room filled with kindling. The strict religious beliefs, the social tensions, and the collective fear of the devil created the perfect storm. What might have been dismissed in another time or place became the catalyst for a wave of paranoia and violence that would sweep through the community. It all began with one man, Reverend Samuel Parris, and the strange afflictions that overtook the young girls in his household. This was the spark that ignited the Salem Witch Trials. Reverend Samuel Parris arrived in Salem in 1689 a man whose presence would soon set the stage for one of the darkest moments in American history. Born in London and raised in the Caribbean, Paris came to Salem with high hopes of finding stability and success. But his arrival only stirred the already bubbling tensions in the small, divided community. Paris was rigid in his beliefs, a strict Puritan minister who preached with fire and brimstone. He saw the world as a battleground between God and the devil, with Salem caught in the crossfire. His sermons were intense, filled with warnings of Satan's influence, and they left his congregation anxious and fearful of what might be lurking in their midst. As tensions in the village mounted, something strange began happening in the Paris household. In the winter of 1692, Samuel's 9-year-old daughter, Betty Paris, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, started exhibiting unusual and disturbing behaviours. They would scream out in terror, contort their bodies in unnatural ways, and complain of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Their fits grew more and more alarming, and soon other young girls in the village, Anne Putnam, Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott, began experiencing similar episodes. The girls' afflictions terrified those who witnessed them. They writhed on the floor, their limbs jerking as if pulled by unseen hands, their voices rising in anguished cries. In a deeply religious community like Salem, where the supernatural was not just believed in but feared, it didn't take long for whispers of witchcraft to circulate. But how could such madness take hold in such a small, God-fearing village? To answer that, we must turn to another figure in the Paris household, Tituba, an enslaved woman of African and Caribbean descent. Tituba's role in the unfolding events would become pivotal. In Salem, the people lived under strict Puritan codes, where any deviation from the norms of society was viewed with suspicion. Tituba's background and customs were foreign to the Puritans, and it's said that she would tell the children stories of magic and folk traditions from her homeland. These tales, combined with the religious fervor already gripping the village, sparked the girls' imaginations. Soon their play acting turned into something much darker, and their fits grew more intense. It was in this climate of fear and confusion that the town's physician, William Griggs, was called in to examine the afflicted girls. Griggs was no expert in diagnosing the strange behaviours he encountered. After all, medicine in the late 17th century was still largely based on superstition and a limited understanding of the human body. Unable to find a physical cause for the girl's symptoms, Griggs reached a chilling conclusion. The girls were bewitched. This diagnosis was not taken lightly. In a world where the devil was believed to be an ever-present force, the idea that young girls could be under the influence of witchcraft was enough to send shockwaves through the community. With a declaration that the girls were bewitched, Salem plunged into a state of mass hysteria. What had started as strange behaviour in a few young girls had now escalated into a full-blown crisis. The townspeople were terrified. If witchcraft had taken root in their village, spread quickly, fanned by Paris's sermons and the mounting fear that the devil was working among them. But it wasn't just fear that fueled the hysteria. It was also the opportunity to settle old scores. Salem was a village already torn by divisions, and now, in the midst of the witchcraft panic, people began pointing fingers. Old grudges, property disputes, and simmering rivalries became fodder for accusations. The girls, under the pressure of their fits and the growing attention they received, began naming names. They claimed to know who had bewitched them, and the first to be accused was Tituba herself, along with two other local women, Sarah Good, a beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman with a reputation for scandal. Tituba, caught in a whirlwind of fear and confusion, would eventually confess to practicing witchcraft, though whether her confession was coerced or an attempt to save herself from harsher punishment remains uncertain. Her confession would only add fuel to the fire. She spoke of visions of the devil, of strange creatures and black magic. Her words sent shivers down the spines of the people of Salem. If Tituba's stories were true, then the devil's hand was indeed at work, and more witches must be lurking in the shadows. The spark had been lit, and soon the accusations would spread like wildfire. Salem was no longer just a village. It had become a battleground between good and evil, and the line between the two grew increasingly blurred. As the number of accused began to rise, the question of guilt or innocence seemed less important than the desperate need to root out the supposed evil in their midst. It all began with three names: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. These were the first to be accused in the swelling tide of paranoia that gripped Salem in 1692. Tituba, the enslaved woman from Reverend Samuel Paris's household, was an easy target. Her different background and customs made her stand out in the tightly controlled Puritan world. Sarah Good, a homeless woman who begged door to door, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly widow with a scandalous reputation, were also vulnerable to suspicion. They were women on the fringes of society, already seen as outcasts in a community quick to judge. It didn't take much for the whispers of witchcraft to land on their shoulders. When the girls, led by Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, named these women as their tormentors, it set the stage for what would become a frenzy of accusations. Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were dragged before the local magistrates, Samuel Sewell and John Hathorne, to answer for crimes that, in any rational setting, would have seemed absurd. But Salem was no longer rational. Fear had twisted the townspeople's perception, and they were ready to believe that witches were at work in their midst. The accusations snowballed from there, growing in intensity and number, and before long, it wasn't just outsiders like Tituba or social outcasts like Sarah Good who were targeted. It was neighbours, friends, even family members. The weight of the hysteria fell heaviest on Tituba. When she stood in front of the magistrates, she was faced with a terrifying choice: confess and maybe save herself, or himself, of signing his book, and of witnessing other women doing the same. "I saw the devil's book and I signed it," she claimed, and in those words she sealed her fate and deepened the paranoia that had already begun to consume Salem. Tituba's confession was a turning point. She described the devil's book as being filled with the names of other witches, a revelation that stoked the flames of fear. If more witches were out there, hiding in plain sight, then no one could be trusted. Her tales of flying on sticks and of shadowy figures tormenting the girls in their sleep played into the very worst fears of the Puritan mind. The villagers, already primed to believe in the devil's power, took her words as truth. In a community that believed God and Satan were locked in a constant struggle for souls, Tituba's confession was proof that evil had infiltrated their world. But it wasn't just her confession that caused the hysteria to spread. It was the use of spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was a controversial form of testimony based on the idea that the spirit or spectre of a person could leave their physical body and commit acts of witchcraft. The afflicted girls claimed that they could see these spectres, accusing the spirits of the accused of pinching them, biting them, and even trying to choke them. The courts took these claims seriously, believing that if the girls saw a person's spirit harming them, then that person must be guilty of witchcraft. In any other circumstance, such testimony would have been dismissed as fantasy. But in Salem, where fear had become the driving force behind justice, it was accepted as evidence. Spectral evidence was dangerous not only because it was impossible to disprove, but because it turned the very nature of reality upside down. If the mere accusation that someone's spirit was committing harm could lead to a conviction, then no one was safe. Innocent people, with no defence against such claims, found themselves at the mercy of the accusers. The girls, fueled by attention and growing power, named more and more people, each accusation drawing the community deeper into the hysteria. The fact that no physical proof was needed, only the testimony of those who claimed to see invisible forces at work, meant that the net of suspicion grew wider with each passing day. What's worse, the accused had no way to fight back. How could you argue against an invisible force? How could you prove that your spirit wasn't tormenting the girls in their sleep? For many, the only option was to confess, whether they were guilty or not. The fear of execution was real, and for those standing trial, a confession, no matter how false, seemed like the only way to survive. And so, more confessions followed, each one feeding the fire of fear that blazed through Salem. As more and more people were accused, wives, husbands, children, even the elderly, the village descended into chaos. Neighbour turned on neighbour, families were ripped apart, and the once tight-knit community was now fractured by suspicion and paranoia. The fear of witchcraft had infected every corner of life, and soon it wasn't just the outcasts or the vulnerable who were being accused. People from and soon a new court was convened to deal with the growing crisis. The court of oyer and terminer, established specifically to try the accused witches, would become the stage for the darkest days of the Salem Witch Trials. In June of 1692, the fear that had gripped Salem reached a tipping point. The accusations had become too many, too widespread for the local magistrates to handle. What began as whispers in the village now demanded the attention of higher authorities. The colonial governor, Sir William Phipps, responded by creating a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The name, taken from Old French, means to hear and determine, and that was exactly what the court was tasked with. Hearing the endless accusations of witchcraft and determining the fates of those caught in the storm. This wasn't just an ordinary court. Its very existence was a sign of how deeply the panic had penetrated society. The establishment of such a court meant that witchcraft was no longer a matter of local gossip or village disputes. It was an official crisis, and the machinery of the law was being mobilized to root it out. Judge Samuel Sewell and Judge William Stoughton were appointed to preside over the trials, with Stoughton serving as the Chief Justice. Both men were devout Puritans, fully convinced that they were engaged in a battle against the forces of evil. Stoughton, in particular, was known for his harshness. To him, the accused were already guilty by the time they stood before the court. His interpretation of the law left little room for doubt or leniency. Cotton Mather, one of the most influential ministers of the time, supported the trials, believing that the devil had indeed infiltrated the colony. In his eyes, the court was a necessary tool to purge New England of this spiritual sickness. Mather was a powerful figure whose writings and sermons helped fan the flames of hysteria, though he would later claim to have urged caution. His early support of the trials was undeniable. The court quickly went to work. The first person brought to trial was Bridget Bishop, a woman with a checkered reputation. She had been accused of witchcraft before, and now, in the fevered atmosphere of Salem, those old suspicions returned to haunt her. Bishop was found guilty of witchcraft, and on June 10th, 1692, she was hanged at Gallows Hill, the first of many to meet that fate. Her death marked the beginning of a dark chapter in Salem's history, one where justice was swift and often brutal, where fear overshadowed reason, and where mercy was in short supply. Rebecca Nurse, an elderly and well-respected woman in the community, was one of the next to face trial. Her case shocked many in Salem. Nurse was known for her piety and kindness, traits that should have made her immune to such accusations. But in the atmosphere of fear that had consumed the village, no one was safe. Even her standing in the church couldn't protect her from the girl's accusations. Despite a strong defence and numerous petitions from her supporters, Rebecca Nurse was convicted of witchcraft. Her execution on July 19th sent a clear message. No one, no matter how virtuous, was beyond suspicion. Perhaps the most dramatic trial of all was that of George Burroughs, accused was executed, another casualty of the relentless hysteria. 19 people were hanged in the course of the trials, their bodies swinging from the gallows as a grim reminder of the price of fear. Others languished in prison, where the conditions were so poor that several died before they could even stand trial. The air in Salem was thick with dread, and no one could predict who might be accused next. Each hanging, each execution only deepened the community's paranoia. To the court, these deaths were a necessary evil, an unfortunate but unavoidable cost in the fight against Satan's forces. And then there was Giles Corey. His story stands out, not just for its brutality, but for his defiance in the face of overwhelming fear. Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, was accused of witchcraft in September 1692. When he was brought before the court, he refused to enter a plea. This wasn't an act of submission, but one of protest. By refusing to plead, Corey hoped to avoid forfeiting his property, which would have left his family destitute. But the law had a grim way of dealing with those who refused to cooperate. Corey was subjected to a form of torture known as pressing, where heavy stones were placed on his chest in an effort to force a plea from him. He never gave in. As the weight on his body increased, crushing the life out of him, his only words were, "More weight." Giles Corey's death was slow and agonizing, but his defiance left a mark on the community. His refusal to bend to the court's will made him a symbol of resistance, and his last words, "More weight," echoed through history as a testament to his strength. His execution was one of the darkest moments in the trials, a reminder of just how far the hysteria had gone. By the end of September, the court of oyer and terminer had overseen the deaths of nearly 24 people, either by hanging or through the cruel conditions of imprisonment. What began as a small spark of suspicion had grown into an all-consuming fire, and now even those who had once supported the trials began to question the path they were on. The evidence presented in court, particularly the spectral evidence, became increasingly difficult to defend. As more people were accused, the accusations grew wilder and more unbelievable. Respected members of society, even those who had been involved in the prosecution of others, found themselves in the crosshairs. The weight of the accusations, like the stones that pressed down on Giles Corey, began to suffocate the community. Doubt crept in. Could all these people truly be in league with the devil? The trials, once seen as a righteous crusade, began to lose their momentum. The hysteria that had consumed Salem was starting to falter, but the damage had already been done. The court had done its work, and the blood of the innocent was on its hands. As the winds of doubt began to blow, cracks started to form in the trials themselves. The once unquestioned authority of the court and its use of spectral evidence faced increasing scrutiny. Soon the very foundation of the accused only the outcasts, the poor, or those with questionable reputations. Soon, the finger-pointing extended to prominent citizens, respected members of the community, who, until recently, had been above suspicion. The most shocking accusation of all came when Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself, was named as a potential witch. When the wife of the colony's most powerful man could not escape the widening net of suspicion, it became clear that no one was safe. The Hysteria, once seen as a righteous crusade to cleanse the community of Satan's influence, had turned Salem into a place where fear ruled over reason. Every day, new names were whispered in the dark corners of the village, and every day the court continued its grim work. But as the number of accused swelled, so too did the voices of doubt. Prominent citizens, ministers, and even some who had initially supported the trials began to question the validity of the evidence being presented. How could so many people be witches? How could someone's mere word, without any physical proof, be enough to condemn a person to death? At the heart of this growing skepticism was the use of spectral evidence. The controversial testimony that claimed the spirits or spectres of the accused were seen committing acts of witchcraft, even while their physical bodies were elsewhere. This type of evidence had been the backbone of many of the convictions, but it was also deeply flawed. The accusers, mostly young girls, claimed to see these spectres tormenting them, and the court had accepted their word as fact. But, as the trials wore on, the notion that invisible forces could be used as proof of guilt began to seem absurd to many. Prominent ministers, including Cotton Mather, had initially supported the use of spectral evidence, but as more and more people were dragged before the court, doubts began to creep in. Could the girls truly see the spirits of the accused, or were they caught up in the frenzy of attention and power that their accusations brought them? The lines between truth and falsehood were becoming increasingly blurred, and more people began to question whether justice was being served at all. It was around this time that Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers in New England and father of Cotton Mather, stepped in with a voice of reason. In October of 1692, he published a pamphlet titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, which would mark a turning point in the trials. In it, Increase Mather made a bold and crucial argument. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. His words struck at the heart of the witch trials, calling for caution and reason in the face of the growing hysteria. Mather's pamphlet urged the court to reconsider its reliance on spectral evidence, arguing that no testimony based on invisible forces should ever be enough to condemn someone to death. This intervention couldn't have come at a more critical moment. The public too was growing weary of the trials. The sight of gallows being erected again and again, the fear that anyone, regardless of status or innocence, could be accused, had left Salem deeply shaken. The very his colony in disarray. The accusation against his wife made it impossible for him to remain impartial. Realizing that the trials had gone too far, Phipps made the decision to dissolve the court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. It was a dramatic and decisive step, effectively bringing the witch trials to a halt. Without the court, the relentless tide of accusations began to slow, and the atmosphere of fear that had gripped Salem for so long started to dissipate. The dissolution of the court didn't just mark the end of the trials, it was also a moment of reflection for the community. The people of Salem, who had been so quick to condemn their neighbours, now had to reckon with the consequences of their actions. Many of the accused who had been languishing in prison were released, though not without scars. Families had been torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and reputations ruined. Some of the accused would never recover from the ordeal, and several had died in prison before they could be freed. The courts that followed the dissolution of Oyer and Terminer took a much more cautious approach. Without spectral evidence to rely on, the number of new accusations dwindled, and many of the convictions were overturned. In January of 1693, the Superior Court of Judicature was established, and it swiftly moved to end the remaining witchcraft cases. By May of that year, Governor Phipps had issued a proclamation formally pardoning those who had been accused of witchcraft. The chapter of Hysteria had finally come to a close, but its impact would be felt for generations. Salem was left in the shadow of its actions. How had a God-fearing community allowed itself to become consumed by fear? How had so many people been led to believe that witches were among them? These were the questions that would haunt Salem, and indeed the whole of New England, for years to come. The scars of the witch trials ran deep, and the damage done to the fabric of the community was profound. But even as the trials ended, the legacy of those dark months was only just beginning to take shape. As the dust settled and Salem tried to return to normal life, the people began to realize that the real evil they had been fighting wasn't witchcraft. It was the fear that had clouded their judgment and driven them to destroy the lives of innocent people. With the trials over, it was time to face the consequences, to look back at the decisions that had been made, and to question how such madness had been allowed to take root in their village. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials would be a time of reckoning, both for those who had participated in the trials and for the broader society that had allowed such a tragedy to unfold. The legacy of Salem was one of caution, a reminder of what can happen when fear overtakes reason, and when justice is sacrificed in the name of superstition. In the years following the Salem Witch Trials, the weight of what had transpired began to sink in. The tide of hysteria that had swept through the village left behind a landscape of shattered lives, broken families, and deep scars on the collective conscience. As the fear began to dissipate, it became clear that the trials had not revealed a hidden web of witches, but rather Official pardons were issued for many of those convicted, though it took years for full reparations to be made. Families of the victims were compensated, though no amount of money could ever undo the damage done. In some cases, properties had been seized, lives destroyed, and reputations tarnished beyond repair. Governor Phipps himself expressed regret for allowing the trials to spiral out of control, but perhaps the most poignant apology came from Judge Samuel Sewell. In 1697, 5 years after the trials, Sewell stood before the congregation at Boston's South Church and publicly confessed his guilt. "We have been blind and bound by the devil's delusions," he said, acknowledging the role he had played in the wrongful convictions. His words were a rare instance of accountability, but they also reflected the deep remorse felt by many involved. The legacy of the Salem Witch Trials did not end with apologies and reparations. The events of 1692 left a lasting imprint on American culture and law. In the centuries that followed, the trials would be remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and the perils of scapegoating. The trials showed what could happen when fear overpowered reason, and when the legal system became a tool for settling personal grudges rather than seeking the truth. Salem's dark chapter would resurface in the nation's consciousness time and time again, most famously through Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Written in the 1950s during the height of McCarthyism, Miller used the Salem Witch Trials as an allegory for the Red Scare, when fear of communism led to a wave of accusations, blacklisting, and ruined lives. The Crucible captured the essence of what had happened in Salem, the way fear can twist a community, how paranoia can become a weapon, and how justice can be corrupted when driven by hysteria. The play has since become a staple in American literature, a powerful reminder of the Salem trials' broader significance. The trials also influenced changes in the legal system. The questionable use of spectral evidence, in particular, sparked debates about what could be considered valid testimony in court. As the colonies moved toward the establishment of more structured legal systems, the Salem Witch Trials became a stark example of what not to do. The protections that would later be enshrined in American law, such as the right to a fair trial, the presumption of innocence, and the rejection of invisible evidence, were shaped in part by the lessons learned from Salem. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Salem Witch Trials is their role as a cautionary tale. For generations, the trials have been held up as a warning about the dangers of unchecked fear and the human tendency to seek scapegoats in times of crisis. The people of Salem weren't evil. They were afraid. They were caught in a wave of mass panic, and in their desperation to restore order, they turned on each other. The trials are a reminder of how quickly reason can be lost when fear takes over. is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature. How far would we go to protect ourselves from an imagined threat? How willing are we to believe the worst about our neighbours? And how often have we, like the people of Salem, allowed fear to blind us to the truth? As we look back on the events of 1692, we can see that the Salem Witch Trials were not just a product of their time, but a timeless example of how fear can distort reality. The aftermath of the trials may have brought about justice for some, but the deeper wounds they left behind are a reminder of the fragility of justice itself. And as we turn to the conclusion of this tragic chapter, we are left with the sobering understanding that the lessons of Salem are as relevant today as they were more than 3 centuries ago. In the end, the legacy of Salem is not just about witches or trials or even fear. It's about the human capacity for both destruction and redemption. The Salem Witch Trials are a powerful reminder of how fear can take hold of a community and lead to unimaginable consequences. What began as a few strange behaviours quickly escalated into a frenzy of accusations, trials, and executions. The causes were many: strict religious beliefs, personal vendettas, and the ever-present fear of the devil. But at its core, the Salem Witch Trials teach us important lessons about the dangers of unchecked power and the fragility of justice when paranoia clouds our judgment. We've seen how innocent lives were lost, families torn apart, and a once tight-knit community fractured beyond repair. 19 people were hanged and others died in prison, all based on accusations born out of fear. These events left a lasting impact, not just on Salem, but on the entire course of American history. They remind us that justice must always be rooted in fairness, truth, and reason, not fear or hysteria. As we close this chapter, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. History has so much to teach us, especially when it comes to the consequences of letting fear take the reins. Here at the ASMR History Hub, we explore these stories to remind ourselves that the past, no matter how dark, can guide us toward a brighter, more just future. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the ASMR History Hub. We dive into fascinating stories from history, always with the intention of bringing calm and thoughtfulness to your day. If there's a topic you'd like me to cover in the future, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, as our journey together comes to an end, I encourage you to take a deep breath, let the past settle in your mind, and carry forward the lessons of Salem. History has a way of repeating itself, but by understanding it, we can make sure the events of Salem stay firmly